The choice to homeschool and design my own education curriculum was and is among the most important choices. And the process was an organic one. My third grade teacher at the Hawthorne Valley Waldorf School in upstate New York died in a car accident. The new teacher was brought in, under duress and couldn't handle the class in a culture where, well, we have a couple of compounding things. In many ways, my relationship with Uta was healthier, and I felt more present than my relationship with my parents. However, in a family dynamic where expressing feelings and naming feelings and being present to feelings was taboo, the grief of my teacher dying went immediately into a very numb dissociation where I marveled that I felt absolutely nothing. And yet, I began acting out. It was called hyper, was the term used by my parents. And the substitute teacher couldn't deal with the acting out, and I couldn't deal with the intensity of feelings in a culture where it was taboo to express and deal with grief. And so the teacher laid down an ultimatum that basically said that I needed to be expelled, or and I think I was about 8 at the time, or that he was going to quit. The school expelled me. I did some private tutoring, but this was also, layerings of isolation, because having been labeled a troublemaker, and this was for fidgety type, kind of compulsive distractions, the kind of thing that a human being does when they're protecting the conscious mind from deep emotional states that those around them lack the skill and ability to hold. And so it's not safe to enter the deep feelings. Because if you enter deep feelings in your body and nobody knows what to do, or you're punished for them, etc., it's an even deeper pain. And so, my sense is that, consciously or unconsciously, I was protecting the bond with my father, who needed not to feel things and not to express things. And so, that left my emotions in a deep state. And, subsequently, so time with tutoring, time in class. The Michael Hall Waldorf School wasn't sure that I was up for readmittance into a Waldorf school because of the dialogue with the Hawthorne Valley Waldorf School. And so we see the dynamic of incompetent parenting and an incompetent culture creating a framework where trauma is repeatedly induced in a child, but no grown-up around knows how to deal with it, which leads to coping mechanisms. You either deal with intense, strong emotions directly and consciously, or you communicate in various ways that they're not welcome, which means that it's not that they go away, just vanish because the surrounding culture is emotionally or traumatically illiterate. No, what happens is an adaptive coping mechanism is developed with the child that allows the intensity of electricity, the intensity of energy that's captured in the body to be released. And if the grown-ups provide no outlet for that, then it comes out compulsively. And so that hyperactivity, inability, OCD, inability to focus on anything was directed at me. And so one of the things that's being communicated in this process at a deep level is that I will be the fall guy for an incompetent culture. I will be the fall guy for my teachers and parents not knowing how to facilitate or talk about their own grief and emotions or mine. You can't really offer something to another until we give it to ourselves. And in that dynamic, there's a certain distrust. There's a certain loneliness, both within the self, and also a growing skepticism. If a child is truly made a fall guy for the incompetence of the culture and then punished in that dynamic, there's a natural withdrawal of trust. What else don't you know that you don't know about? What else are you going to set me up to fail with? And I think that sense of being set up to fail, and that people would be happier if I was willing to fail and be blamed and punished for failing than they would be to deal with their own feelings, leads to a very deep sense of betrayal, pain, and loneliness, which in turn leads to a questioning, meaning it is healthy and intelligent for an individual who is repeatedly punished for the inadequacies of the cult around them to question the legitimacy of the leadership within the cult, because the legitimacy of leadership is determined by the degree of service provided by the leader to the circle. To the degree that the leader understands, responds to, empathizes with, and serves the circle, is to the degree that the leader earns a biological and felt sense of legitimacy. Now, there's plenty of masquerading and positioning and power structures for illegitimate leaders to gain roles out of fear and out of mental confusion. Cults play games all the time that are self-referential. They say that mental articulation is to be elevated. Why? Because we elevate it. Why is it to be elevated? Because we elevate it. And everyone wants to be in that elevated position. So it's completely self-referential. And then the cult, does its little dogma about, look, this is that thing that we said should be elevated. And so this creates, an overlay of mental confusion, because the strategy of survival, security, love and belonging, and self-esteem requires one to adapt and integrate with the cult around you, starting with your family, because that is the best strategy for surviving, feeling secure, having a sense of love and belonging, and thus internalizing all of that into self-esteem. So if that's the best strategy of survival, then if the cult is being irrational on a large scale, the mental part wants to bend and meet needs by facilitating the cult values, whereas the emotional and biological sense have a truer sense of what things are, but this splits the self between surviving in the underlying environment, which might be more about physics and natural selection and geometry and chemistry, etc., that have underlying principles that cannot be doctored with. And so there's one set of survival that comes from looking out at nature and learning from a 5 billion year old teacher. And then there's this other survival thing that comes from the rapid moving elements of human beings that surround us that have enormous influence and a great deal of insanity. A great deal of insanity meaning that the doctrines and a lot of the cult behavior does not have a scientific basis that is sound and conscious with a coherent explanation, which is why you have so much "because I told you so," and this just go to school, get in it. It doesn't matter if it's useful in your life. It's just do it because everyone's doing it. And that was the line that was sold to me. And so, I went back to Michael. I joined a public school when the family moved to England, went back to Waldorf School with Michael Hall, then went to Cyprus and, dissociated again, then went back to Michael Hall, then went to the Findhorn community in Scotland, and at a conference, listening to Sam Keane talk about Faces of the Enemy and I think there was Fire. I don't think he'd written Fire in the Belly, but there were several things, and I just remembered thinking clearly. I was enjoying listening to him. I was enjoying being in the conference. I enjoyed the whole world there. Seemed about 3 times more interesting than anything I was learning at school. And so I made the choice to leave school against everyone's protest. So my teacher at Michael Hall, Peter Cook, protested the idea. My parents were ambivalent. People at Findhorn didn't think it was good that a 12, 13-year-old was leaving school to spend time at Findhorn. But none of them gave excellent explanations and as to why exactly. And this is the issue when there's a series of losses in credibility. To the psyche, if you induce a state in another human being, for example, if I slap you up over the head a few times and your cheeks turn red, and then I embarrass you for having red cheeks, pretending like I had nothing to do with it, there's a loss of credibility at a deeper level of the psyche, regardless of the cultural noise and overlay and confusion. At a deeper level of the psyche, there's a sense, you are not my friend. You are transferring your incompetency through a manipulation of superior mass. You're using superior mass, being a grown-up, having money, having legal authority, to transfer an incompetent program onto me. So it's not that you're more intelligent, it's that you've got superior legitimacy within a faulty cult that I don't trust. And so we have a very, deep rift there, and I felt that in my stomach a great deal of the time, and I've often looked down because there's a certain sense of shame in the betrayal that says at a deep level that what you're doing to me is wrong. You know at a deep level that it is wrong. And yet you are using your influence in a powerful role in the cult to steer me as a young person in the wrong direction so that you don't have to face how fucked up things are and that you don't know what to do about it. You're not going to tell me the truth, and that's a betrayal. And so I've had a sense of shame knowing that in many instances the grown-ups around me knew that they were lying. And they knew that I knew they were lying. And there was some anger. I remember Peter Cook, my sixth grade Waldorf teacher at Michael Hall, being angry at me until I played the fool. Then that was fine. If I frittered away and wasted my time at school playing the fool, he was perfectly okay with that. But he did not want certain things touched at, certain things looked at. And I felt his rage. I felt his rage coming at me as I looked into those areas. And I didn't know how to respond, again, so I played the fool to accommodate the fact that he didn't know how to make a connection there. And so there's this split between the adaptive personality that is in a dissociative, numb, and somewhat sociopathic state, and this deep hurt that's not getting addressed. And no one wants to deal with the underlying message. And there's a sense of betrayal, a sense of shame in that. I've never been good or wanted to put on a face. And so I've generally withdrawn in that message, carrying the shame that was given to me. The shame that I wasn't worth telling the truth to. That my life was being sacrificed to accommodate coping strategies that helped grown-ups around me avoid discomfort. I knew that. I felt that. I felt the dagger of that message. And I felt the shame that I cannot force a parent, a grown-up, or a teacher to value me enough, to value themselves enough, to tell me the truth. And this is one of the deepest wounds that I've received in this lifetime and in this culture. Grown-ups who I desperately needed validation and a message that I mattered, instead turning away so as not to face the lies they asked me to believe in order to facilitate their own comfort. And this is a very deep sense of injustice, betrayal, anger, and deep pain. Because I'm asked to carry the lie that nothing's going on around this. Because they can't carry the message of the betrayal. Now, this, for whatever reason, resonates very deeply with my sense of goodness, of justice, of idealism. My sense of beauty, truth, and goodness is deeply violated by that program of lying to those who have less power, whether it's men lying to women to have sex with them, whether it's women lying to men to get money, whether it's parents lying to children so they don't have to think, whether it's parents lying to children so they don't have to face the horror of their own brutality towards their children and towards themselves, their own self-hatred and the hatred towards the child, to instead pretend that this is all love because we don't want to deal with the reality of our hatred and the violence of that hatred. So that's something that sits very deep in the kind of just below the solar plexus kind of belly area here. And I separated from school in an initial positive and then went into depression, etc., in Missouri. There again, Phoenix International School for Peace and Ecology turned out to be a goat herd, an Angora goat farm for delinquent kids, with a big pile of garbage in the forest that nobody knew what to do with, so they just dumped all the garbage in the forest. And there were a few juvenile delinquents there. It had nothing to do with the name, and so I knew I was in trouble if I was completely on my own. I wasn't at Findhorn at the time. And so I felt like the Vancouver Waldorf School, when my family went to Canada, was better than that. So I went back to that. But every time I was on my own, I deepened the sensitivity to my own feelings. And every time I came back into family and school life, those deeper feelings were violated by willful ignorance, by a lack of respect, by a lack of empathy, by a lack of present connection. And so it seemed to me that if I was to have integrity with myself, I had to get myself out of the high pressure, game, acting out type environment of high school and into an introspective environment where I could journal and write and all that. And so I went back and forth there. Now, when I left the Vancouver Waldorf School, I did a little bit of a survey. And I talked with my math teacher, and I talked with an arts teacher, and I talked with Kyle Morton, the woman I ultimately, moved in with. And in that dynamic, every parent, and my mother was quite against it at this point, said that I should go to school. My father, when he was violating several boundaries and I had to use physical force to stop him coming into my room, called the police on me. And again, the police gave, a lecture about how I wouldn't be able to get a job without this and that and the other. And so there was a clear consensus in the grown-ups around me around don't do this on your own. Whatever you do, get your GED, and the best way to do that is to be in high school. And I actually listened to a recording of that police interview because I recorded it because I was already at 14, 15, clear that without a recording of things, grown-ups could not even be trusted to, grown-ups would lie to me about what they said and what they did 10 minutes ago. And so I brought this tape recorder into, the police interview, etc. And I would say that the policewoman, a very nice woman, betrayed me again. In the force dynamic with my parents, I explained to her that my parents would not respect boundaries and that I had tried everything. Requests, penalties, locks on the door, etc. They wouldn't respect boundaries. And I said the only thing they respect, now that I have a body that's big enough, is physical force. And my father was having a fit about this. And the police woman was trying to get me, the child, to promise not to hit my father. And I said, what I can promise you is I will not initiate violence. I will respond at an intensity that is directed. I will mirror so that what you do to me, you feel yourself. Because when you've got sociopathic parents, if they don't feel what they're doing to you personally, they don't stop. They don't stop because they're concerned with you. They stop because they don't like the way they feel when their own pain is mirrored back to them. And the policewoman went at me for about 20 minutes, and I would not agree not to mirror the violence directed at me. And I told her, I said, my mom can't possibly win in a violent dynamic, so I'm not using my full strength. But if she slaps me at, say, a 6 out of 10 intensity, I'll slap her back at a 6 out of 10 intensity using her scale so that she experiences what she's doing to me. And I said, furthermore, it works. She's stopped hitting me. And my father, was just blathering on, about how he should have the right to do whatever he wants in his house and blah, blah, blah. And again, it worked. And the policewoman ultimately put a little pressure on my father. She said, it sounds like Dana's agreeing not to hit you unless you hit him. And he didn't want, to accept that. He wanted basically the right to beat his children and not have them fight back, and to be able to call the police on a minor for abusing his child. And the police leaned in that direction and said that I was behaving quite unusual given that I was living under their house and all that. This is a tragedy. This is an atrocious state of affairs for so many young people in our culture. It doesn't matter what the abuse is, but the idea that, I was stupid enough to conceive children without bothering to develop parenting skills, and that gives me the right to dish out that abuse indiscriminately with police protection when you have no legal place to go. I explained this to the police. I said, I have no other options. I can't leave home. My father has let our passports expire. We're in Canada. What am I to do? I'm not imposing myself. I'm withdrawn into my room. But that's not good enough for my abusive father. He wants to have access and invade my space for, who knows what reason. It's not like he wants to have an emotional connection. So there's a tremendous sadness. And the question is, when you're terrorized, whether it's by the police, the parents, etc., where does a child go with that dynamic? Particularly when, the New Age cult around, because my father was the head of a nonprofit and sent us to Waldorf school, and we sometimes ate organic food, and we were vegetarians. All these little labels got slapped on as "aren't you lucky?" when I would happily have eaten meat and potatoes and had a parent capable of emotional connection and empathy with their child, and capable of being an adult, which means fighting the demons within and the demons within the cult, fighting the dragons of lust, compulsiveness, addiction, all that, to protect the child, and being honest when there is a betrayal, owning the inadequacy. I'm sorry, I'm too lazy, or I'm too scared to, protect you in this area. You're worth protecting. I'm too lazy to do it. So, I'm sorry. There you have the grown-ups behaving like adults and owning their own inadequacy. But this is so rarely done, with parents blaming the child. And I was finding all of this very hard to process since it was semi-conscious. It's hard as a teenager to become fully conscious of the pain and the grief of this betrayal, because there's so much helplessness around it. There's nothing worse than feeling isolated and helpless to protect oneself legally, financially, physically, and emotionally from the abuse of superior masses that are too dumb to know that they're dumb and are angry at the intelligence in the child. They're angry that you want more. They're angry that I want more for my siblings and myself than I'm receiving, and I don't want that called luck. When I'm stuck in a dissociated state, unable to grieve, unable to feel my feelings, etc., I don't want to be called lucky by people that want to superimpose their projections on my world and my life rather than deal with the fact that they also do not want to see, do not want to feel, do not want to be intimate, but rather want to project a fantasy version of reality and will, to some extent, isolate or punish or get defensive if I try and break through the projection and exist in the way that I actually feel. So in the second round, with all that going on, in the second round as I left school, I understood that all the adults were again completely against it. But I also understood that none of them were thinking. None of them were talking in rational terms. And when the police woman said, that it's tough, she says it's tough out there. It's tough getting a job. And if you don't have a diploma and maybe some college, it's tough out there. And I said to her what I think is a really good and self-respecting statement. I said that anyone who could not tell that I was competent to do whatever it was I said I was good at, if they can't directly experience my competency, but instead will look at a piece of paper. In other words, I might be completely incompetent, but the paper says I know what I'm doing, so I should be hired. Or I might be very competent, but the paper doesn't exist, and they lack the independent means to determine my competency. I'm not interested in working for that person. Because if I was hiring someone, I never have looked at bits of paper. I give them a job for the day if they show up on time and demonstrate the traits that I'm interested in the interview. I give them a day's work. And I expect that, give or take, they will behave the way they do on that first day. That, if they're an alcoholic, there will be traces of that on their face or whatever. If they're compulsively late, they'll be late on the first interview and the first thing. If they're don't really want to work hard, then when I pull back and let them do whatever they want to do, they'll show me who they are. And that's exactly what I expect them to be. Now, it may not be perfect, but I expect people to behave the way they behave, period, until a force equal or greater comes along to interrupt that cycle. And so I felt like there were three costs that I was paying to go to high school. One is I had to clamber into the chaos and insanity of the family car to go to school and be picked up, and had to deal with, the humiliation and irritation of my parents being late and this and that and the other, which embroiled me deeper into the family system, which allowed me to be hooked more and brought in. And I felt like my best survival strategy was complete dissociation from the family, because my father tormented people who he had emotional hooks in. And besides, they were so chaotic I couldn't maintain my routine. See the section in routine. And that dynamic, so that was painful. Then there was the pain of the fact that no other student in the school was being honest with what was going on. And having spent some time at Findhorn and this and that and the other, I would talk about and try and engage with people. And it was just, I felt like 20% of what I was learning was relevant to my life, and it was being learned 50% inefficiently, just due to the environment. I learned best one-on-one. And so I decided to leave, and then I slowly worked towards my curriculum. And that really took off after my routine. See the video on routine. That really took off around routine. And so I was very happy with the way that I developed my education curriculum, which began with the question, which I think is an incredibly relevant question for any forward-thinking and relevant education system. And that is, what skills and traits and abilities are going to be most relevant to the species over the next 100 years. And one of the first things that I looked at was grounded imagination, the ability to scan possibilities and then sort through this possibility is an 8 out of 10 in this metric, this possibility is a 9 out of 10 in that other metric, and weigh different possibilities, and then start taking action on possibilities and designs that were likely to bear fruit. And that the ability to imagine a very large range of possibility, one, and then to analyze the possibility field relative to a variety of values, two, and then to prioritize where I would act and what I would study in this. I thought that this was one of the single most important skills that would be needed for the species over the next 100 years. I also thought that waste transformation, learning how to take these vast amounts of waste, energy that we as a culture tie up into forms that we don't know what to do with. So we dig big holes in the ground. So I thought the technology of taking that energy and repurposing it in more healthy ways would be, a terrific skill to learn. Cooking is, of course, a fabulous skill to learn. People are very happy when you feed them exceptional, healthy food. And so, the art of cooking. Yoga, which helped center me, manage the different energies that I was dealing with, etc. A very useful skill, empowering me. Poetry, helping me understand the language of imagery, a very powerful skill. Meditation and metaphysics, a central skill and thought around life. Landscape, sustainable landscapes. The planet is a landscape. Everyone enjoys a beautiful exterior environment. And it's something that I'm interested in. It's tactile, etc. So creating sustainable landscapes was a skill that seemed interesting. Creative and clear, lucid communication in written form seemed a very valuable skill. Studying from successful people also seemed intelligent. And so I built my curriculum on these things, on thinking, on metaphysics, grounded imagination. I did not pursue the sustainable garbage, etc., mostly because, as a one-person entity with no funding, it was beyond my grasp. I didn't have access to the information at the time. There wasn't an internet. When I was 14, 15, so I didn't have access to the information. Nobody would take me seriously as, 14, 15-year-old. And, so it just seemed like the level of challenge to the system, that redesigning the idea, eliminating the idea of waste, basically, and understanding that intelligent cultures do not end up with waste. They end up with energy in a more and more usable form. That's the essence of intelligence, to turn one's environment into a form of energy that facilitates more value and more well-being. Not so little value that you don't know what to do with, and so you spend energy to dispose of it in a giant hole or dump it in the ocean, etc. That is a very low level of sophistication. And but it felt the gap between me and even getting into the room with someone where I could start gathering data. It's just too big of a gap. And I wonder as I look at app technology today and what I think is most important over the next 100 years for our species, I wonder how long it will take us to start empowering the beauty of and the idealism of our young into collaborating and having the data and taking them more seriously than the typical grown-up who's sold out to a drugged-out system that they hate but don't have the courage to counter or change. So I wonder about that. And in the same vein, I felt that what I was studying by reading biographies. I read the biography of Henry Ford Sr., Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, John D. Rockefeller Sr., there were several other tycoons in the area. I forget one of them. But then I looked at the work of Napoleon Hill in his book Think and Grow Rich, and Dale Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie was the other one, the steel magnate, etc., that formed the Carnegie libraries. So in that dynamic, I looked at the way different successful people had done different things in their life. And the more I've done that in my more recent years, the more delightful it is to understand there's so many strategies for weaving a life, for weaving the garment of consciousness. And, you'll hear the exact same thing, contradicted. One person stays up till 4 a.m., the other person always wakes up at 3 a.m., and it's all about getting up early, and so there's a tremendous tapestry of variety, amongst highly competent and successful people, which speaks to uniqueness. But that process led me to form. I also studied sales and marketing because you need that to start a business, to have a service, and so there was a lot of that study. Now, as a result of this, I started my business at age 17, my landscape business, and have had that company ever since. What I learned from the unanimous backlash against the idea of thinking, against the idea of a self-designed homeschool system, was again that grown-ups either couldn't or wouldn't think, and were quite happy to use their influence to steer my life without showing it respect for what it could be. And there's a lot of sadness in there. I would say that probably 60% of my grief and fear and loneliness ties in with my awareness that to satisfy and please grown-ups in various ways, I've sold out an enormous amount of emotional, relational, intellectual, physical potential. because it makes them so happy when you do whatever it is they want you to do that's familiar to them. And it makes them so nervous and uncomfortable when I do something intelligent that, the sadness is that it is my kindness and my pity for their discomfort that leads me to sell out not just myself, but what I can bring to this lifetime. To make grown-ups comfortable, I sell out my species. I sell out myself. I sell out my own probability field. And there's incredible grief that I know what is lost, but the people asking me to give it up do not even have the decency to measure and honor what they're asking me to give up to make them comfortable. There's a lot of sadness there. And they can't hear that sadness. So having asked for a betrayal, they then ask for an invisibility of the betrayal, which means that I don't get empathized with around the betrayal. So it's a layered betrayal that can go on endlessly, because that leads to depression, and then you have people then asking you to own that the depression is all about you, rather than that I wouldn't be in the slightest depressed if I was surrounded by people who invited out the beauty, the honesty, the intelligence, who were delighted to discover how they could improve things, who were happy to learn where they were wrong, and were able and willing to grow with that and say, yes, this is wonderful. And I have not been surrounded by those grown-ups, because that's one of the distinctions between a child in a grown-up's body and an adult. And the emotional frailty of the amount of loneliness, etc., has left me with only so much stamina to go head to head with very frightened, angry grown-ups who have the ability to punish me for speaking the truth. So this education protocol, first of all, made money. It didn't cost me a dime, it made me money. Second of all, it increased my impact by 1,000%. For example, I learned creative writing by submitting relevant articles about my values to local magazines. And I found a great fit in Shared Vision in the Vancouver area. And they published every single thing that I wrote. And I edited everything that I wrote 8 times, because I said, this isn't just for some crappy teacher who's staying up late, wasting their time to grade me on a paper that I didn't want to write, that they don't want to read, and that no one's ever going to see. Complete waste of everyone's time. This is a document that's going to go out to 35,000 subscribers. And it's worth doing 8 times, because I'm writing about things that I care about. And so, that was a delightful way of expanding my influence more than 1,000%, so that one thing, even if I had done nothing else in my homeschool, self-funded, self-designed, self-enacted, self-taught homeschool program, that it would seem more intelligent to have done those articles than to spend the entire time in high school, if that was it. But that wasn't it. I was learning sustainable horticulture. I was learning to study. I was learning to think. I was learning, most importantly, if you read Jobs and Gates' biography, you understand that they got a lot of pushback, that there was a lot of pushback to them. And so you understand that there's actually a pattern in our culture where we take innovative people and we punish them for being innovative. And then that kills off most of the innovation. But then there's a few rare individuals that are stubborn enough or dissociative from the culture enough. For example, Bill Gates is very sociopathic in many levels, which means he's more self-referencing, which means that when everyone tells him that's not the way to do it or you're too young or whatever, he just does it anyway because he's pushing away, the empathy, etc., for worrying about all these grown-ups who won't take the time to really think and understand him, to support that dynamic. So one of the more important decisions I've done, it took something that was costing my parents, thousands of dollars a year into making money and not costing me a dime. And it took me from a place of trying to manage crazy environments to managing good problems and healthy environments. It prepared me for life in many ways, that you don't get herded around unless you're going into, a 9 to 5. You don't get herded around by people telling you what to do outside of school. So if you don't learn that self-discipline, you can't be an entrepreneur. And my father was definitely a positive influence in his own migration from, I think he finished high school, started a health food store, started a metaphysical bookstore, started a health food restaurant, then started building passive solar homes, then became a director of an offshore currency hedge fund, Gaia Corp, in London, then became, a hedge fund kind of salesperson for Gaia Corp and as a currency hedge fund. And so there was definitely some good example that one could, with initiative and intelligence, migrate around. I remember my father telling me on one of the London trains as we were driving, he said he had just visited a large hedge fund director. He was describing this big, fat hedge fund director, and he said they're terrified. They don't know what they're doing. They just don't want to lose money and lose their job. And so, it's all about risk management for most of them, and they only want to do what everyone else is doing, so that they're not caught. And he said that his introduction, meaning, what made him an effective salesperson in a hedge fund environment with billions of dollars on the line, was 5 words in his vocabulary. He said, Dane, if you can learn when and how to use 5 words in some of these power circles, you're in. That's all it takes, is understanding when and how to use 5 words, which just tells one that one's in a landscape of fools. So it's very, in that sense, there's a liberation. My father was not. He was ambivalent. He thought I should do what I wanted to do, because I think he was aware of how dysfunctional the school system was. My mother was against it. He was ambivalent. Everyone else said no. It's definitely been one of the more important choices. And it is also an isolating choice because I had no friends. Peers could not track what I was doing. And so to the extent that I talked, they kind of turned away. And so I had no peers. There were no other students in my self-designed homeschool I was alone in my room. That also has, an impact in the willingness to go what is upstream of the cult, but downstream in terms of first principles. Elon Musk, who's one of my mentors, talks a lot about how to ignore what everyone else has done and build something scientifically using the first principles of physics. And you just build up and you look at, can something be done or not? And he used that to start Tesla and SpaceX. And so that type of design and analysis has always made sense to me. And the fact that I've been isolated has in some ways, given how much I need people's love, it's a catch-22, given how much I need people's, care and affection and warmth, I think it would be harder. It would be harder to betray my safety or coping strategies to secure that warmth if it was readily available to me in large doses, but I had to give it up in order to think, in order to follow a path of integrity. And I've been in that situation to some degree, and there's a certain relief about being single and isolated, in that I can tune into myself now and ask first principle questions and see where that takes me without being worried about what someone else is going to say or feel or how upset, how nervous it's going to make them, that I can talk to a stranger without getting all tight, because I know how the people around me get worked up about various things. So if I start thinking something that I know I'm going to talk about, that is going to work up a lot of people around me. There's a part of my body cringing. It's like, don't see that truth. Because if you see that truth, you're going to talk about it. If you talk about it, all these people are going to get upset. And then they're going to either punish you or this, or you're going to lose that little bit of warmth, that you've wanted so much since infancy. You're going to lose it. Because that's how they're going to discourage you from making them uncomfortable. They're going to withdraw the affection. And there's definitely a stress and a grief and just a lot of energy stored up in anticipating that. And there's also some counterphobic energy where when I feel all that pressure, there's a part of me that wants to both distance and then double down in uncomfortable, in arenas that are going to make other people uncomfortable, as kind of a defiance that I'm not going to fully sell out my perception simply because my perceptions make a lot of people uncomfortable a lot of the time because I act on them. I mean, even those people who enjoy, fabulous intellectual debates as a kind of a cat and mouse game, they're very uncomfortable with, okay, get out your checkbook, let's do something with this. And so that's uncomfortable for someone who's comfortable with the intellect, etc. Is that action. And I'm not interested in intellectual theories. I'm interested in the science of well-being and what can be efficient in those terms. So this, this was a big pivot point. And as it has paid off over the years, one of the ways that it's affected me is that I'm more inclined to think that if I've thought something through and 95% of people think it's a terrible idea, I'm more likely to think, aha, when's that happened last time? Aha, what about that school system? What about the fact that both times I left school, everyone thought it was a bad idea? And now everyone tells me that they wish their kids were as intelligent, or they wish that their kids were this motivated. So they want the results that come from my strategy, but they want to get the result through their strategy. And I see the insanity of parenting in that domain all the time, because every single parent who has in some way told me, I wish my child was like you, and they did that a lot, in my late teens, because I was much more mature than 97% of the children my age. There was not a single parent who wished their child turned out like me, who was interested in learning how they could support their child in doing the things that would lead that to be a probability. And so that's completely insane, and it is a deep betrayal of the child. Because if you're the authority and you say, I wish my child was not the way that they're becoming under my guidance, but more like you, where you're becoming under your guidance, one. But two, I'm not even interested in taking a single action to actually change my parenting or family or anything like that, or my child's education or anything. Instead, I want a very different set of results than the results that I'm getting using my protocol. And I want to get them continuing to use a faulty protocol. It does not take a genius to understand that that is cruel and ignorant. And who it is most cruel to is the child, who is betrayed because their parent doesn't want to think or doesn't want to be uncomfortable or doesn't want to face the unknown. And so in many ways, this journey has liberated me to the humor and the peace with the fact that ultimately I need to trust myself. There's an ability that I've developed to using grounded imagination to analyze and examine that's right 70% of the time. Brilliantly right 70% of the time. Well, that means that 70% of the time I experience an extraordinary result if I design and try something that I'd never do with experience with conventional means. And then I fail. And a large part of the reason I fail is that many of the more sophisticated designs require maybe only 6 people. They require the loyalty and dedication of 6 people. And I cannot find individuals with that loyalty and dedication. I can't find people willing to turn 2 of their 4-hour-a-day, TV consumption towards this, and so that's a failing, again, of the cult. Because when those few individuals do make it through all the different obstacle courses of delusions and insanity and trauma and dissociation and shaming the child for the parent's inadequacy and all, the endless loops of cultural dynamics, and actually learn to think and learn to vision and learn to see, there is no welcoming guild of human beings saying, let's nurture this skill and take it into its full maturity in a way that honors your soul and spirit. Oh, there's commercialism that wants to say, we'll make a lot of money and we don't care about other people. We don't care about the fact that this would disrupt your marriage or whatever. You've got to do this to make a lot of money. But that's a betrayal, since the data doesn't support that making a lot of money is particularly intelligent. In many cases, it shows a crudeness in design when we look at the fallout, of that over a variety of other things. And so I've been growing and learning and fiddling around, for example, with my virtual assistant. My creativity and productivity has gone up hundreds, if not thousands of percent. And that's phenomenal. And so I'm working within the system to kind of find that out. But the other thing that is a big fallout of this whole education program is that because I only pick the most relevant things that I believe in, using thorough analysis to study, I never want to stop learning, because cooking has been endlessly valuable to a great number of partners and lovers. Cooking has been great. It's been a great skill to develop and master. But there are other skills that I haven't developed, whether it's massage to the degree that I could, or any number of other things that are also really valuable and beautiful skills. So I want to close by inviting you to think, to invite you to learn 3 skills, to develop and embellish 3 skills that will deeply enrich the quality of your life, and in that, doing so, those around you. And that also have the possibility of reach, of moving out into the larger culture and shifting the balance. Cultures and in the species are part of this big pendulum. And at both extremes, the cults are toxic. And so we're at an extreme of chauvinism, moving back to the honoring of feminine energy in men and women. Honoring presence, honoring transparency, honoring immediacy, honoring beauty, honoring images, honoring intuition, honoring the inner world, honoring the journey there as opposed to just getting there. We're on a journey in that direction. And skills that facilitate that movement back to center as a species are in very high supply. Well, they're in very high demand. And it's incredibly valuable to believe in something and do it. It creates strength because it integrates thoughts, feelings, values, and actions. Thank you.